Rain hammered the city's west side that autumn night. The streets ran empty, except for the blinking neon of establishments that stayed open for those with nowhere else to go, the powerful, the damned, those who traded family for empire. Vincent Rossi stood alone in his penthouse office, surrounded by symbols of absolute power, Cuban cigars, surveillance monitors showing his territory, framed photos of a family he'd abandoned for this throne. Yet the silence screamed louder than any enemy ever had. At 52, he'd built an empire that controlled half the city's underworld, but tonight, after ordering the execution of a traitor, he felt nothing but crushing emptiness. Fear, money, an empty throne, he whispered to his reflection in the rain-streaked window. This is the legacy. ####. Character introduction, the boss in his fortress. Vincent Rossi wasn't born a monster. He was made into one. Silver-haired with a scar bisecting his left eyebrow, a reminder of his first knife fight at 17, Rossi carried himself with the coiled menace of a predator who'd survived every challenge to his territory. His tailored Italian suits cost more than most people earned in a year, but they couldn't hide the violence etched into his posture, the calculation behind his penetrating dark eyes. He'd survived 3 assassination attempts, 2 federal investigations, and countless gang wars. He'd built an empire from nothing after watching his father, a humble bakery owner, die penniless and disrespected. Young Vinny had sworn he'd never be helpless, never be poor, never be invisible. He'd kept that promise. Now he was Vincent, the Ghost, Rossi, a name that made hardened criminals lower their voices. He had power, wealth, territory, and an organization that ran with mechanical efficiency. But tonight, alone in his fortress, surrounded by loyalty bought with blood money and fear, he confronted the truth: he'd won everything and gained nothing. The boy who once loved Coltrane and believed loyalty meant protection, that Vinny was buried so deep, Rossi wondered if he'd suffocated years ago. ##### Inciting incident, 3 blocks away, 3 lives converge. 3 blocks from Rossi's penthouse, in the neighborhood his organization controlled, 3 people moved through the rain-soaked streets, each carrying a piece of truth the crime boss had spent decades avoiding. Father Matteo DeAngelis, 32, adjusted his collar as he carried groceries to Mrs. Chen, an elderly parishioner. The young priest had been assigned to St. Anthony's Church 6 months ago, a struggling parish in a dangerous neighborhood where the name Rossi was whispered with fear and respect. DeAngelis knew the Mafia boss by reputation, ruthless, untouchable, beyond redemption. But the priest believed no soul was truly beyond reach, even if he privately doubted whether his faith was strong enough for this mission. Isabella Hart, 34, sat in her modest apartment, staring at her brother Daniel's guitar. The social worker had spent 2 years trying to channel her grief into helping others, but tonight, the anniversary of Daniel's death, rage consumed her. Her brother had been killed in crossfire during one of Rossi's territorial wars, an acceptable loss in the criminal calculus. She'd compiled evidence, tracked patterns, and tonight she'd made a decision: Rossi would see Daniel's face, know his name, and understand the human cost of his empire. Moses Bennett, 78, packed up his saxophone after playing at the neighborhood jazz club. The legendary musician had known Vincent Rossi before he became the Ghost, back when he was Vinny, a 19-year-old kid who'd come to shows with light in his eyes, who'd believed in beauty and loyalty. Moses had watched the transformation from troubled youth to feared crime lord, and it haunted him. Tonight, he'd decided it was time to speak, to remind Rossi who he'd been before violence consumed him. None of them knew the others existed. None of them planned to converge. But destiny, or divine intervention, was about to collide 3 strangers with one man's carefully constructed armor. ##### The moment that changes everything, when walls begin to crack. It happened at 11:47 p.m., outside a restaurant Rossi owned. Father DeAngelis crossed the street, arms full of grocery bags, just as Rossi's black Mercedes pulled up. The priest didn't flinch when the crime boss emerged, didn't show the fear Rossi was accustomed to inspiring. Their eyes met. DeAngelis could have walked away. Should have, by any reasonable calculation. Instead, he held Rossi's gaze and spoke with quiet certainty. "The door is always open, Mr. Rossi. Whenever you're ready." Then he walked past, leaving the crime boss standing in the rain, shaken by a simple truth: someone believed redemption was possible for him. That a door existed. Within 48 hours, the convergence accelerated. Isabella confronted Rossi in a parking garage, her grief raw and accusatory, forcing photos of Daniel into his hands: birthday parties, graduation, a young man laughing with friends. "You don't get to forget," she said, voice steady despite tears. "You don't get to pretend your empire doesn't have a body count of innocent people." She walked away, leaving Rossi with a specific face to attach to his abstract, collateral damage. Moses appeared at Rossi's private table in the jazz club, uninvited and unafraid. "I knew you when you were still Vinny," the old musician said. "Before you forgot how to hear music." He spoke of transformation, of the boy who once believed loyalty meant protection rather than domination, and left Rossi with a haunting question: "The boy I knew is still in there. Question is whether you've buried him so deep he's suffocated." 3 strangers. 3 voices. 3 pieces of truth, ***. Father DeAngelis offered the possibility of redemption, unconditional acceptance and a spiritual framework for forgiveness. Isabella demanded accountability, the face of his victims and the moral reckoning he'd avoided. Moses carried memory, proof that Rossi hadn't always been a monster, that transformation was possible because he'd chosen differently once. Together, they shattered Rossi's certainty that he was beyond saving. And as their presence disrupted his carefully constructed isolation, something else was happening. Marco, the Blade, Santini, Rossi's most trusted lieutenant, was meeting secretly with rival families, planning a coup that would either kill the boss or force him from power. The external empire was crumbling. The internal walls were cracking. And Vincent Rossi stood at an impossible crossroads: defend the throne he'd built on corpses or risk everything for a salvation he didn't believe he deserved. The question wasn't whether he could survive the coming storm. The question was whether he wanted to survive as the monster he'd become, or risk transformation into something he'd forgotten how to be: human. 3 strangers had entered his orbit, carrying faith, grief, and memory. And nothing would ever be the same. The call came at 2:47 a.m., the hour when the city's respectable citizens slept and its wolves prowled. Vincent Rossi listened to Tommy's voice on the encrypted line, flat and professional: "It's done. Clean. No witnesses." Rossi ended the call without responding and returned to the window of his penthouse, 43 floors above the streets he controlled. Below, the city glittered like scattered diamonds on black velvet, his kingdom, bought with blood and maintained through fear. Marco Benedetti, the lieutenant who'd been feeding information to the FBI for 18 months, would be found in the river by morning. The message would be clear: betrayal had consequences. He should have felt satisfaction. Vindication. The electric surge of power reasserted. Instead, he felt nothing. Rossi poured 3 fingers of scotch, 25-year-old single malt that cost more than most people's monthly rent, and studied his reflection in the rain-streaked glass. Silver hair slicked back, the scar bisecting his left eyebrow, a white slash against tan skin, tailored suit that cost $6,000. At 52, Vincent Rossi was master of an empire that stretched across the eastern seaboard. He had politicians in his pocket, judges who owed him favors, and an organization that ran with mechanical efficiency. His name made hardened criminals lower their voices. But the man in the reflection looked hollow. Haunted. The penthouse itself was a monument to success and a mausoleum for connection. 12-foot ceilings, original artwork worth millions, furniture so expensive it looked uncomfortable, which it was. The space was designed to impress, to intimidate, to showcase power. It succeeded brilliantly. It also felt like a tomb. On his desk sat a silver-framed photograph he hadn't looked at in months, his mother, dead 15 years now, standing outside the bakery his father had owned in the old neighborhood. Before the gambling debts. Before the men came to collect. Before young Vinny watched his father beaten so badly he never fully recovered, dying 6 months later with nothing but shame and empty pockets. Rossi had sworn he'd never be helpless like that. Never poor. Never invisible. Never at the mercy of men who took what they wanted and gave nothing back. He'd kept that promise with a vengeance. By 19, he was running numbers. By 25, he'd eliminated 2 rival crews and consolidated territory. By 30, he'd built an organization that controlled the docks, the construction unions, and half the legitimate businesses in 3 boroughs. He'd survived assassination attempts, federal investigations, and gang wars that left bodies stacked in morgues. He'd won. Completely and utterly. So why did the victory taste like ashes? The scotch burned going down but brought no warmth. Rossi checked the surveillance monitors that covered every approach to his building, every entrance to his businesses, every corner of his empire. All quiet. All secure. All under his control. All meaningless. He tried to remember the last time he'd had a conversation that wasn't transactional. The last time someone had looked at him with something other than fear, calculation, or the performative loyalty money bought. The last time he'd felt anything resembling joy. The memories were there, buried under decades of violence and paranoia, but they felt like they belonged to someone else. Young Vinny, who'd loved jazz and believed loyalty meant protecting people rather than dominating them. That boy was dead. Rossi had killed him himself, one brutal choice at a time, until nothing remained but the ghost he'd become. By 7 p.m., Rossi needed to move. The penthouse felt suffocating, the silence accusatory. He told Tommy he was going to check on the restaurant, Lucia's, a upscale Italian place in the neighborhood where he'd grown up, now gentrified beyond recognition. The food was excellent, the wine list impeccable, and every table filled with people who had no idea the man who owned it had ordered 3 executions that year alone. He sat at his usual table in the back, sight lines to both exits, and picked at osso buco he didn't taste. Around him, couples laughed over wine. Families celebrated birthdays. Normal people living normal lives, their biggest concerns mortgage payments and whether their kids would get into good colleges. Rossi watched them with something close to envy. They had no idea what it took to build empires. What had to be sacrificed? What remained when you finally sat atop the throne? Nothing. The answer was nothing. He left at 10:30, waving off the manager's effusive gratitude, and stepped into the autumn night. Rain had started falling, cold and insistent, turning the streets slick and reflective. His Mercedes waited at the curb, Tommy at the wheel. That's when he saw the priest. Father Matteo De Angelis was crossing the street, arms laden with grocery bags, his black shirt and white collar visible even in the dim light. He was young, early 30s at most, with dark hair and an open face that hadn't yet learned cynicism. He was heading toward the old apartment buildings where pensioners and holdouts from the neighborhood's previous life still clung to rent-controlled units. Rossi's Mercedes was blocking the crosswalk. The priest could have walked around. Could have waited. Instead, he approached the car, grocery bags in hand, and made eye contact with Rossi through the window. Most people looked away when they recognized him. Averted their eyes, suddenly fascinated by their phones or the pavement. The smart ones knew better than to see Vincent Rossi, to acknowledge his presence, to exist in his orbit longer than necessary. Father De Angelis didn't look away. He didn't show fear. Didn't show deference. Didn't show the calculation of someone angling for favor or the performative respect people paid to dangerous men. He just looked at Rossi with quiet recognition, one human seeing another, and spoke in a voice that carried through the closed window with surprising clarity. "The door is always open, Mr. Rossi. Whenever you're ready." Then he walked past, continuing toward the apartment building, grocery bags swinging slightly with his stride. Rossi sat frozen, his hand halfway to the window control he'd never lowered. The priest hadn't stopped. Hadn't waited for a response. Hadn't treated the statement as the opening of a negotiation. He'd simply stated a fact and moved on. The door is always open. Whenever you're ready. The words implied something Rossi hadn't considered in decades, that redemption was possible. That somewhere, a door existed. That the man he'd become wasn't the only man he could be. That he might want something other than this empty throne. Boss? Tommy's voice pulled him back. You okay? Rossi realized he was gripping the armrest hard enough to hurt. Drive, he said, his voice rough. As the Mercedes pulled away, he watched the priest disappear into the apartment building in his rearview mirror, carrying groceries to people who needed them, performing small acts of service that changed nothing and meant everything. The door is always open. The seed was planted. And in the hollow place where Vincent Rossi's soul should have been, something long dormant began to crack. The underground parking garage beneath Rossi's office building was a concrete cathedral of shadows and echoing footsteps. 3 levels below street level, accessed only by keycard, it represented the kind of security money could buy, cameras in every corner, reinforced steel doors, and Tommy always 3 steps behind with his hand near his weapon. Rossi had just finished a meeting with his accountant, legitimate business masking the flow of money that couldn't be explained to the IRS. His mind was still churning through numbers when he stepped out of the elevator at 2:15 p.m. on a gray Thursday afternoon. She was waiting by his car. Tommy's hand went to his jacket immediately, but Rossi held up a finger. The woman wasn't armed, he could tell from her posture, the way her hands hung loose at her sides, the absence of that telltale weight shift people made when carrying concealed. She was mid-30s, auburn hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, wearing jeans and a worn peacoat. Her face was composed, but her eyes burned with something that made Rossi's instincts flare. Not fear. Not calculation. Something far more dangerous, purpose. Mr. Rossi, she said, her voice steady and clear in the garage's acoustic chamber. My name is Isabella Hart. You don't know me, but you killed my brother. Tommy moved forward, but Rossi stopped him with a gesture. He'd survived this long by reading situations, understanding threats, calculating angles. This woman wasn't here to hurt him physically. But the way she stood, planted, determined, grief-armored, told him she was here to hurt him some other way. I don't know what you're talking about, he said, the automatic deflection he'd perfected over decades. But you shouldn't be here. This is private property. Daniel Hart, she continued as if he hadn't spoken. 2 years, 3 months, and 16 days ago. Corner of Mulberry and Hester. Your organization was moving into territory the Costello family claimed. There was a firefight. Rossi remembered. It had been a necessary escalation, a message that his expansion wouldn't be stopped by outdated territorial agreements. The Costellos had shown up with 8 men. Rossi's crew had been ready with 12. The skirmish lasted 90 seconds and ended with 2 of Costello's men dead and the rest retreating. I remember a business dispute, Rossi said carefully. Nothing to do with civilians. Daniel was walking home from his shift at the hospital, Isabella said, and now he could hear the tremor beneath her control. He was a respiratory therapist. 28 years old. He helped people breathe. She pulled an envelope from her coat pocket, and Tommy tensed again, but she moved slowly, deliberately. She opened it and removed a stack of photographs. You don't get to call it a business dispute, she said, stepping forward. You don't get to reduce my brother to collateral damage. You're going to look at these. Rossi could have walked away. Could have signaled Tommy to remove her. Could have deployed the lawyers who made problems like this disappear with settlements and non-disclosure agreements. Instead, he looked. The first photograph showed a young man with Isabella's eyes and an easy smile, wearing a hospital ID badge, arm around a woman in scrubs. Both of them laughing at something off camera, the kind of unguarded joy that came from genuine connection. That's Daniel with his fiancée, Marie. They were supposed to get married that fall. The next photo, a backyard birthday party, the same young man blowing out candles on a cake while a group of friends and family applauded. Balloons. Streamers. The ordinary celebration of an ordinary life. His 27th birthday. He made the cake himself. He loved baking. Another, Daniel in a hospital corridor, kneeling beside a small child who was laughing, showing the kid something on his phone while medical equipment beeped in the background. He specialized in pediatric respiratory care. Kids loved him. He could make them laugh even when they were scared. Isabella's hands shook now as she showed him more photos. Daniel playing guitar at what looked like an open mic night. Daniel hiking with friends, mountains behind them. Daniel at graduation, cap and gown, diploma held high, pure pride and possibility in his expression. "You don't get to forget," Isabella said, and tears were streaming down her face now though her voice remained steady. "You don't get to pretend your empire doesn't have a body count of innocent people. Daniel wasn't in your world. He wasn't part of your business. He was just walking home, and your bullets don't discriminate between soldiers and civilians." She thrust the photos at Rossi's chest, and he took them reflexively. His hands that had ordered executions without tremor, shook slightly as he held the images. "He died on the sidewalk while your people drove away," Isabella continued. "He bled out in 4 minutes. Marie held him. She still screams in her sleep. My mother had a stroke 6 months later from the stress. My father can't look at guitars anymore." Rossi stared at the photograph on top, Daniel's laughing face, so alive, so full of future that would never arrive. "I'm not here for revenge," Isabella said, her voice breaking now. "I'm not here to threaten you or ask for money. I'm here because you need to know. You need to see his face. You need to understand that every time you make a business decision, someone's brother dies. Someone's son. Someone's fiancé." She stepped back, wiping her face with her sleeve. "What do you want to leave behind, Mr. Rossi? What legacy are you building? Because right now, it's measured in families destroyed. In futures erased. In mothers who bury their children." She turned to leave, then looked back one more time. Daniel wanted to bring beauty into the world. He wanted to help people breathe. "What do you want?" Then she walked away, footsteps echoing in the concrete chamber, leaving Rossi standing with a handful of photographs and no answer to her question. Tommy cleared his throat. "Boss, you want me to?" "No," Rossi said quietly. "Let her go." He stood there for a long time, unable to move, staring at Daniel Hart's face. For 2 years, that death had been an abstraction in his mind, collateral damage, unfortunate but inevitable, the cost of doing business in a violent world. He'd justified it, rationalized it, filed it away under acceptable losses. But now Daniel Hart had a face. A smile. A fiancée named Marie. A mother who'd had a stroke. A father who couldn't look at guitars. Now he was real. Rossi tried to summon his usual defenses, the cold logic that separated business from sentiment, the hard calculus that deemed some sacrifices necessary for larger goals, the armor that had protected him from feeling the weight of his choices. They didn't come. Instead, he saw Daniel kneeling beside a sick child, making them laugh. Saw him blowing out birthday candles. Saw him in a hospital corridor, helping people breathe. Saw the future that had been erased because Vincent Rossi had decided Mulberry and Hester belonged to him. "Boss?" Tommy asked again, uncertain in a way Rossi had never heard before. "Drive me home," Rossi said, his voice hollow. That night, alone in his penthouse, he spread the photographs on his desk. He'd intended to put them away, to dismiss them, to return to the comfortable numbness that had sustained him for so long. But he couldn't stop looking. Daniel's face stared back at him from a dozen moments of joy and connection and ordinary beauty. A life lived in service to others. A man who'd wanted to help people breathe. And for the first time in years, Vincent Rossi couldn't justify what he'd done. Couldn't rationalize it. Couldn't dismiss it as the unavoidable cost of power. He could only see what Isabella had forced him to see, the human cost of his empire, measured in specific faces and specific futures, in families destroyed and beauty erased. The door is always open, the priest had said. You don't get to forget, Isabella had said. And sitting alone with photographs of a dead man who'd wanted to bring beauty into the world, Vincent Rossi felt the armor around his heart crack just a little wider. The Blue Note was one of Rossi's more legitimate enterprises, an upscale jazz club in the heart of the theater district where the wine list was extensive, the acoustics were perfect, and the clientele paid premium prices to feel sophisticated. The music was always excellent, carefully curated to attract the kind of crowd that appreciated artistry without getting too experimental or challenging. Rossi owned it. He rarely truly listened to it. Friday night at 10:47 p.m., he sat at his usual table in the back corner, sightlines to both exits, an untouched glass of bourbon before him. The quartet on stage was playing something modal and intricate, the kind of thing that would have thrilled him once. Now it was just background noise to his thoughts, which kept circling back to Daniel Hart's photograph still sitting on his desk at home. 3 days since Isabella had confronted him. 3 days of trying to return to normal operations, meetings with his captains, discussions about dock shipments and construction contracts, the daily machinery of empire. But Daniel's face kept intruding. The boy who'd wanted to help people breathe. The door is always open. You don't get to forget. The phrases echoed in his mind like a chorus he couldn't escape. The quartet finished their set to polite applause, and the house lights came up slightly during the break. Rossi reached for his bourbon, finally ready to drink it, when a figure appeared at his table. An old black man, late 70s at least, with a weathered face that carried the history of hard miles and harder choices. He wore a worn but dignified brown jacket, a flat cap, and carried a saxophone case with stickers from clubs that hadn't existed in decades. His eyes were sharp despite his age, penetrating in a way that made Rossi's instincts flare. Tommy moved to intercept, but the old man sat down before anyone could stop him, settling into the chair across from Rossi with the comfortable authority of someone who'd earned the right to sit where he pleased. I knew you when you were still Vinny, the old man said, his voice gravelly but warm, carrying the cadence of someone who'd spent a lifetime making music. Before you forgot how to hear it. Rossi studied him, something familiar tugging at his memory. The face was older, weathered by time and experience, but the eyes. Moses Bennett, Rossi said slowly, recognition dawning. The monk of Mulberry Street. Moses smiled, pleased. You remember. Good. Means the boy isn't completely dead. Moses Bennett had been a legend in the neighborhood jazz scene 35 years ago, a saxophonist whose improvisations could make grown men weep. He'd played the small clubs where young Vinny used to sneak in with a fake ID, desperate to hear the music that made him feel like the world contained more than violence and debt and his father's shame. That was a long time ago, Rossi said carefully, aware of Tommy hovering nearby, uncertain how to handle this intrusion. What do you want? To remind you of something you've forgotten, Moses said, settling back in his chair with the ease of someone who wasn't afraid. I used to see you at the Green Mill, back when it was still a dive. You'd sit in the back, nursing one beer all night, just listening. You loved Coltrane. Bird. Monk. You understood what they were saying. Rossi felt something uncomfortable stirring in his chest. I was a kid. Kids have stupid ideas about a lot of things. You had a different kind of fire then, Moses continued, ignoring the dismissal. Hungry, yeah. Angry at the world, sure. But you wanted to matter. You wanted to protect your mother after what happened to your father. You talked about making sure the neighborhood was safe, that people like your family wouldn't get crushed by men with power. I was naive, Rossi said, his voice flat. The world doesn't work the way 19-year-olds think it does. No, Moses agreed. But somewhere between wanting to protect and wanting to dominate, you forgot the difference. Somewhere between being Vinny and becoming Vincent, the ghost Rossi, you stopped hearing the music. Rossi should have ended this conversation. Should have had Tommy escort this old man out before he said something that couldn't be unsaid. But something kept him in his chair, listening. You know what I was doing when you were sneaking into clubs? Moses asked. I was destroying myself. Heroin. Started in 68, didn't stop until 84. Lost my wife. Lost my recording contract. Lost opportunities one can't even count. Thought I was too far gone, that the music had died in me. He tapped the saxophone case beside him. But someone gave me a chance I didn't deserve. Minister at a church I wandered into, looking for money to steal. He didn't call the cops. Didn't preach at me. Just said, you look like you used to be someone. That hit harder than any sermon. Made me remember who I was before the needle. Moses leaned forward, his eyes holding Rossi's with uncomfortable intensity. Took me years. Rehab. Relapses. Crawling back. But I learned something, transformation is possible. Not easy. Not clean. But possible. The man you become doesn't have to be the man you are. I'm not an addict, Rossi said, but the words felt hollow even as he spoke them. No, Moses said. You're addicted to something worse. Power. Fear. The empire you built to protect yourself. But it's the same prison, just with better furniture. Rossi felt anger flash through him, the reflexive rage that had kept him alive, that had made him untouchable. You don't know anything about my life. About what it takes to survive. I know you used to cry during Coltrane's Alabama, Moses said quietly. I watched you. 19 years old, tears running down your face, because you understood what he was saying about grief and beauty and transformation. That boy felt things. That boy wanted to create beauty, not just survive. The anger drained as quickly as it had come, replaced by something Rossi hadn't felt in decades, shame. That boy was weak, he said, but his voice cracked slightly. The world eats people like that. The world eats people like you too, Moses said. Just slower. From the inside out. Until there's nothing left but the ghost. He stood, picking up his saxophone case. I'm playing a set at a basement club tomorrow night. Place in the old neighborhood, nothing fancy. Just music. The kind we used to have before they gentrified everything. You should come. Not as Vincent Rossi. Just as someone who used to love listening. Why? Rossi asked, genuinely confused. Why do you care? Moses smiled sadly. Because I knew you when you were still Vinny. And that boy deserves a chance to breathe, even if you've buried him deep. Question is whether you've buried him so deep he's suffocated. He turned to leave, then paused. You've been playing the same violent song for 30 years, Vinny. You remember any other melodies? Then he walked away, weaving through the tables toward the exit, leaving Rossi sitting alone with a question he couldn't answer. The quartet returned for their second set, launching into a ballad that Rossi suddenly recognized, Coltrane's Naima, a love song to the saxophonist's first wife, haunting and beautiful and achingly tender. And for the first time in decades, Vincent Rossi actually listened. He heard the spaces between notes, the conversation between instruments, the way the music created something larger than any single player. He heard what he'd forgotten, that beauty existed, that transformation was possible, that the world contained more than violence and transaction. He heard what Moses had been trying to tell him, that the boy who'd sat in clubs with tears running down his face wasn't dead. Just buried. Suffocated under 30 years of armor and anger and the desperate need to never be helpless again. The door is always open. You don't get to forget. You remember any other melodies? 3 strangers, 3 voices, 3 pieces of truth converging on the fortress he'd built around himself. Father DeAngelis offering redemption. Isabella demanding accountability. Moses carrying memory of who he'd been before he became this. Rossi sat through the entire second set, bourbon untouched, listening to music for the first time in years. And when the quartet played their final note, he realized his face was wet. He was crying. Not from fear or anger or the violent emotions that had sustained him for decades, but from grief for the beauty he'd abandoned, and the terrifying possibility that it might not be entirely lost. The priest was waiting outside Rossi's gym when he emerged at 6:30 a.m. on Tuesday morning, sweat-soaked from an hour of punishing exercise that hadn't quieted his mind. Father DeAngelis stood on the corner across the street, hands in his coat pockets, breath misting in the October cold. He didn't approach. Didn't wave. Just stood there, present and unhurried, as if he had nowhere more important to be. Their eyes met. DeAngelis offered a slight nod, acknowledgement, not greeting, and then walked away, disappearing around the corner before Tommy could intercept. The door is always open. Rossi climbed into his Mercedes, unsettled in a way he couldn't name. The priest hadn't said anything, hadn't done anything, yet his mere presence felt like an invitation constantly extended, a question constantly asked. Thursday afternoon, Rossi inspected a construction site in Brooklyn, a 12-story luxury development that would launder $3 million in untraceable income over the next 18 months. He was reviewing foundation specs with the site manager when he saw the black shirt and white collar among the construction workers. Father DeAngelis was speaking with the day laborers during their break, handing out bottles of water, laughing at something one of them said. He glanced up, caught Rossi's eye, and smiled, not triumphant or challenging, just warm, before returning to his conversation. He was everywhere and nowhere, never forcing contact, never making demands. Just present. A living reminder that redemption existed, that doors remained open, that transformation was possible even for men who'd built empires on violence. Rossi tried to focus on the construction specs, but the priest's presence lingered like incense in his peripheral vision. On Friday, Isabella's package arrived. Tommy brought it to Rossi's office at 10 a.m., having already X-rayed it and checked for explosives. It was a guitar case, battered and covered with stickers from music venues and social justice causes. Inside, an acoustic guitar, well-loved, the wood worn smooth where fingers had pressed strings for years. The note was tucked under the strings, handwritten on simple paper. Asterisk, this was Daniel's. He played at open mics, nursing homes, children's hospitals. Anywhere people needed beauty. He wanted to bring light into dark places. What do you want to leave behind, Mr. Rossi? When you're gone, what will remain besides fear? Isabella Hart, asterisk. Rossi lifted the guitar carefully, feeling the weight of it, the history embedded in the worn finish. He could picture Daniel playing it, the laughing young man from the photographs, fingers dancing across strings, creating beauty for sick children and lonely elderly people and anyone who needed reminding that the world contained more than suffering. He set it against the wall of his office where he'd see it every day. A question made tangible. Saturday brought Moses's gift. The package arrived via courier, a vinyl record in pristine condition, the cover showing John Coltrane in prayer-like contemplation, a love supreme. Inside, a note on the back of a blue note business card. Asterisk, this is what transformation sounds like. Coltrane recorded this after getting clean, after finding God, after choosing to become something more than his addiction. For movements, acknowledgement, resolution, pursuance, psalm. The journey from brokenness to grace. Listen to it, Vinny. Really listen. The boy who understood this music is still in there. MB. Asterisk. Rossi hadn't owned a record player in 20 years. He bought one that afternoon, expensive, audiophile grade, the kind of equipment that would do justice to what Coltrane had created. That night, alone in his penthouse, he lowered the needle onto the vinyl and listened. The music washed over him like a baptism he hadn't asked for and didn't deserve. Coltrane's saxophone crying out in spiritual ecstasy, the rhythm section driving toward transcendence, the entire composition structured like a prayer. Acknowledgement. Resolution. Pursuance. Psalm. A roadmap for transformation, expressed in sound. Rossi listened to all 4 movements twice, and when it finished, he sat in silence, understanding what Moses had been trying to tell him: change was possible. Even for someone as far gone as Coltrane had been. Even for someone as lost as Vinnie Rossi had become. 3 strangers. 3 gifts. 3 voices asking the same question in different languages. Can monsters change? But while these voices converged on his conscience, something else was happening in his empire, something he'd been too distracted to notice until it was almost too late. Marco, the Blade, Santini had been Rossi's lieutenant for 8 years, reliable and ruthless, trusted with sensitive operations and confidential information. They'd survived the Castello War together, the federal investigation, the internal purge that had claimed Marco Benedetti. Now, on Sunday evening, Tommy brought Rossi surveillance photos that made his blood run cold. Marco meeting with Anthony Castello at a restaurant in Queens. Marco shaking hands with federal prosecutor James Chin outside a courthouse. Marco in deep conversation with Paulie, Knuckles, Rizzo, captain in the Gambini family, at a social club Rossi's organization had declared off limits. How long? Rossi asked, his voice deadly quiet. At least 2 months that we can confirm, Tommy said, his face grim. Maybe longer. He's been careful, but he got sloppy with the Castello meat. One of our guys spotted him. Rossi spread the photos across his desk, his mind already calculating angles, assessing damage, planning response. Marco knew about shipments, money flows, political connections, vulnerable points in the organization's structure. If he was coordinating with rivals and the FBI, he could bring down everything Rossi had built. The old response was automatic: eliminate the threat. Marco would have an accident. Tonight. Clean and final. Send a message that betrayal had consequences, reassert dominance through fear, maintain the empire through brutal efficiency. Rossi's hand moved toward his phone to give the order. Then he saw Daniel's guitar leaning against the wall. Heard Father DeAngelis's voice: the door is always open. Heard Isabella's question: what do you want to leave behind? Heard Moses's challenge: you remember any other melodies? His hand stopped. In the old days, hell, 2 weeks ago, this would have been simple. Marco was a traitor. Traitors died. The calculus was clean, the solution obvious, the violence necessary to preserve order and power. But now, with Coltrane's "A Love Supreme" still echoing in his mind, with photographs of a dead respiratory therapist on his desk, with the priest's quiet presence haunting his periphery, the calculation felt different. If he killed Marco, he'd maintain his empire but confirm everything he feared about himself, that he was beyond redemption, that violence was his only language, that the boy Moses remembered had indeed suffocated under 30 years of brutality. But if he showed mercy, if he tried another path, he'd likely lose everything. Marco would interpret restraint as weakness. The organization would fracture. Rivals would smell blood. The empire he'd built to never be helpless again would collapse, and he'd be vulnerable in ways he hadn't been since he was 19 years old and terrified. Boss? Tommy asked, waiting for the order he expected. The order Rossi had given 100 times before. Rossi looked at the surveillance photos. At Daniel's guitar. At the vinyl record sleeve showing Coltrane in prayer. 3 voices converging: faith, accountability, memory. 2 crises colliding: the eroding empire and the awakening conscience. 1 impossible question: can monsters change, and what does it cost? Give me 24 hours, Rossi said finally. Don't move on Marco yet. I need to think. Tommy's expression showed confusion. This wasn't how Vincent Rossi operated. You didn't hesitate. You didn't think. You identified threats and eliminated them before they could destroy you. But Rossi was no longer sure that survival through violence was the same as being alive. The door is always open, whenever you're ready. What do you want to leave behind? This is what transformation sounds like. 3 strangers had entered his life, and now he stood at a crossroads he'd never imagined facing, the trigger or the altar, the throne or transformation, dying as the monster or risking vulnerability for uncertain salvation. And for the first time in 30 years, Vincent Rossi didn't know which path to choose. At 2:47 a.m. on a moonless Wednesday, Rossi gave up pretending he could sleep. He'd been lying in his king-sized bed for 4 hours, staring at the ceiling, haunted by faces that wouldn't leave him alone. Daniel Hart laughing with his fiancée. Moses Bennett's eyes asking if the boy inside had suffocated. Isabella's voice demanding to know what he wanted to leave behind. And beneath it all, the surveillance photos of Marco meeting with enemies, the decision he'd been postponing for 3 days now, the impossible choice between the only life he knew and something he couldn't even name. He rose, dressed in dark slacks and a sweater, and told the night security he was going for a drive. Tommy offered to accompany him, but Rossi waved him off. Some things needed to be done alone. He drove through empty streets, no destination in mind, just movement to escape the thoughts that wouldn't stop circling. The city looked different at this hour, softer somehow, stripped of its daytime aggression, just concrete and glass and the occasional light in a window where someone else couldn't sleep. His Mercedes seemed to know where it was going before he did. St. Anthony's Church rose from the old neighborhood like a Gothic ghost, its stone facade darkened by a century of city grime, its stained glass windows black in the pre-dawn darkness. The door would be locked, of course. Churches didn't stay open all night anymore, not in neighborhoods like this. But when Rossi tried the handle, it opened. The sanctuary was dark except for the eternal flame burning beside the altar and a few votive candles flickering in their red glass holders. The air smelled of incense and old wood and something indefinable, holiness, maybe, or just the accumulated prayers of generations who'd knelt in these pews seeking comfort. Rossi hadn't been inside a church since his mother's funeral 15 years ago. Before that, not since he was a boy, dragged to mass by a mother who believed God could protect them from the violence that eventually consumed his father anyway. He slid into a pew near the back, deep in shadows, not kneeling, not praying, just present. The silence was different here than in his penthouse. Not empty or accusatory. Just quiet. Waiting. He didn't know how long he sat there. Time felt suspended, irrelevant. His mind kept playing scenes he'd tried to forget, the first man he'd killed, 19 years old and terrified but desperate to prove himself. The expansion into Costello territory, the bullets flying, the calculation that acceptable losses were acceptable. Marco Benedetti's face when he'd realized Rossi had ordered his execution. 30 years of violence compressed into a highlight reel he couldn't stop. And underneath it all, a question that wouldn't go away: how does someone like me even begin? He didn't hear Father DeAngelis enter. The young priest simply materialized from a side door, probably from the rectory, wearing jeans and a t-shirt, his collar absent, looking more like a graduate student than a representative of God. DeAngelis didn't approach. He slid into a pew 3 rows ahead, off to the side, where Rossi could see him in profile but didn't have to make eye contact. He said nothing. Just sat there, hands folded loosely, waiting or praying or simply being present. The silence stretched. 5 minutes. 10. 20. An hour. Rossi should have felt uncomfortable, exposed, vulnerable in this sacred space with a man who represented everything he'd rejected. Instead, he felt something unexpected: relief. As if by sitting here in the darkness, he'd finally stopped running from something that had been chasing him for 30 years. "I've done things," Rossi said finally, his voice rough in the silence. "Things you can't imagine. Things I can't take back." DeAngelis didn't turn, didn't react. Just kept his gaze forward. "How does someone like me even begin?" Rossi continued. "Where do you start when the list is too long to remember everyone? When you've built an empire on fear and blood and you don't know how to be anything else?" For a long moment, DeAngelis said nothing. Then, still not looking at Rossi, he spoke quietly. "The same way everyone begins. One true thing at a time. That's not enough, Rossi said, hearing the desperation in his own voice. You don't understand what I've. Acknowledgement, DeAngelis interrupted gently. Sorrow. The willingness to change. And accepting you can't erase what's done, only choose differently now. I've ordered executions, Rossi said, the words tumbling out now like a dam breaking. 15 that I can name. Probably more that I authorized without knowing the details. I've destroyed businesses, broken families, corrupted officials. I've built an empire that protects me and hurts everyone else. DeAngelis remained still, listening. There was a territorial dispute 2 years ago, Rossi continued, his voice breaking. We moved into Costello territory. There was a firefight. A respiratory therapist named Daniel Hart was walking home from his shift. He died on the sidewalk in 4 minutes. His fiancée held him while he bled out. He pulled out his wallet, extracted the small photograph of Daniel he'd been carrying since Isabella gave him the pictures. Even in the dim light, that laughing face was visible. He wanted to help people breathe, Rossi said. He made sick kids laugh. He baked cakes. He played guitar at nursing homes. And he's dead because I decided a street corner was worth fighting for. The tears came then, hot and unexpected, years of suppressed grief and guilt and horror at what he'd become. He didn't try to stop them. I was 19 when I killed my first man, Rossi said. He'd disrespected someone in the organization I was trying to join. They gave me a gun and an address. I threw up afterward, but I did it. And every time after that got easier. Easier. Until I could order someone's death and feel nothing. He looked at the photograph of Daniel. I've forgotten how to feel, he said. I've buried the boy I was so deep under violence and paranoia and the desperate need to never be helpless that I don't know if he exists anymore. Moses Bennett asked me if I'd suffocated him. I think maybe I have. DeAngelis turned then, finally making eye contact. His face showed no judgment, no horror, no condemnation. Just compassion and something that looked like sorrow. You're feeling now, the priest said quietly. It's too late, Rossi said. The things I've done, they can't be undone. Daniel Hart is still dead. All those families are still destroyed. What's the point of feeling sorry when sorry doesn't fix anything? Redemption isn't about fixing the past, DeAngelis said. It's about choosing differently in the present. It's about accepting that you can't earn forgiveness for what you've done and doing the work anyway. What work? Rossi asked desperately. How do I make this right? You can't, DeAngelis said, and the honesty of it was almost brutal. You can't bring Daniel Hart back. You can't undo 30 years of violence. You can't erase what you've built or the pain you've caused. He leaned forward, elbows on the pew in front of him. But you can stop. You can dismantle what you've built. You can accept the consequences of your choices. You can spend whatever time you have left choosing differently. Not because it earns you salvation, grace doesn't work that way. But because the alternative is dying as the monster you've become. I don't know how to be anything else, Rossi admitted. Then learn, DeAngelis said. One true thing at a time. Starting with this, sitting here, acknowledging what you've done, being willing to change. That's the beginning. Rossi sat in silence, feeling the weight of 30 years pressing down on him. The empire he'd built. The throne he'd claimed. The ghost he'd become. If I walk away from what I've built, he said slowly, it will probably kill me. My lieutenant is already planning a coup. If I show weakness, mercy, anything other than the ruthlessness that kept me alive this long. Then you might die, DeAngelis said simply. But you'll die as Vincent, not the ghost. You'll die choosing differently. That's a terrible comfort. It's the only comfort I have, DeAngelis said. Redemption isn't about deserving it. It's about accepting grace you can't earn and doing the work anyway, even if it costs everything. They sat in silence again, but it felt different now. Not empty. Not accusatory. Just, present. Will you hear my confession? Rossi asked finally. Official confession. Are you Catholic? I was. Long time ago. Do you remember the act of contrition? Rossi closed his eyes, reaching back to childhood memories buried under decades of violence. The words came haltingly at first, then stronger. Oh my God, I am heartily sorry for having offended thee. And there in the darkness, Vincent Rossi confessed. Not everything, that would take days, maybe weeks, but enough. The first killing. The expansion wars. Daniel Hart. The fear he'd cultivated. The boy he'd buried. DeAngelis listened without interruption, without judgment, offering what Rossi needed most, witness. Someone to see what he'd done and not look away. When it was finished, the priest spoke the words of absolution, but added quietly, God's forgiveness is freely given. The work of transformation is yours to do. Rossi sat for a long moment, feeling lighter and heavier at the same time. What happens now? He asked. You choose, DeAngelis said. One true thing at a time. Starting with whatever decision is in front of you. Marco. The Empire. The crossroads. Rossi stood, steadier than he'd felt in years. Thank you, he said. The door is always open, DeAngelis replied. Whenever you need it. Rossi walked out into the pre-dawn darkness, the eternal flame behind him, the first light of morning just beginning to touch the eastern sky. He didn't know if he was ready for what came next. But for the first time in 30 years, he was willing to try. The message Rossi sent to Isabella was simple, I need to speak with you. Name the time and place. I'll come alone. Her response came 6 hours later, Riverside Park. East Bench near the 79th Street entrance. Saturday, 2 p.m. If I see anyone but you, I'm gone. Saturday arrived cold and clear, the kind of October afternoon where autumn announced itself in every gust of wind. Rossi left Tommy at the car 4 blocks away, walked alone through streets where mothers pushed strollers and couples walked dogs and life happened in all its ordinary beauty, the kind of normalcy that had become foreign to him. Isabella was already there when he arrived, sitting on the designated bench, wearing jeans and a navy pea coat, her auburn hair loose around her shoulders. She watched him approach with eyes that held no warmth, no forgiveness, just wary assessment. Thank you for meeting me, Rossi said, stopping a respectful distance away. I haven't decided if this was a mistake yet, Isabella replied. Sit if you want. But I can leave any time. Rossi sat on the opposite end of the bench, maintaining space between them. Around them, the park hummed with Saturday afternoon life, joggers, dog walkers, a father teaching his daughter to ride a bike. The normalcy felt surreal against the weight of what needed to be said. I'm not here to ask for forgiveness, Rossi began, his voice quiet but steady. I don't deserve it, and I'm not sure I'd accept it if you offered. Isabella said nothing, just watched him with those fierce, grief-hardened eyes. I ordered the territorial expansion that led to the firefight that killed your brother, Rossi continued, forcing himself to meet her gaze. It was a calculated decision. I wanted to send a message to the Costello family that I wasn't backing down. I knew there would be violence. I approved it anyway. He pulled Daniel's photograph from his pocket, the one he'd been carrying since she gave it to him. I've been telling myself for 2 years that Daniel's death was collateral damage. Unfortunate but unavoidable. The cost of doing business in a violent world. His voice cracked. I was lying to myself. The truth is, I valued a street corner more than I valued the possibility that innocent people might die. I made that choice. Your brother paid for it. A jogger passed, earbuds in, oblivious to the confession happening on the bench. A child laughed somewhere nearby. I cannot undo that death, Rossi said. I cannot make it right. I cannot give you back your brother or Marie her fiancé or your mother her son. There is no amount of money, no gesture, no penance that balances that equation. Then why are you here? Isabella asked, her voice hard but not cruel. If you can't fix it, if you can't make it right, what's the point of this conversation? Because you asked me a question, Rossi said. What do I want to leave behind? And I'm beginning to understand that the answer I've been living, fear, power, an empire built on violence, is the wrong one. He looked down at Daniel's photograph, at that laughing face full of life and purpose. I'm beginning to understand the human cost of my choices. Not in the abstract. In specific faces. Specific futures that were erased because I decided power mattered more than people. Isabella was quiet for a long moment, watching a woman throw a tennis ball for an ecstatic golden retriever. You want me to tell you that's a start, she said finally. That recognizing what you've done is progress. That I see you're trying to change. No, Rossi said. I want you to tell me what comes next. Because I don't know. Isabella turned to face him fully, and the intensity in her eyes made him want to look away, but he forced himself to hold her gaze. I don't want your guilt, she said, her voice fierce. I don't want your confession or your acknowledgement or your personal spiritual journey. You know what I want. Rossi waited. I want you to stop, Isabella said. I want you to dismantle the machine that kills people like my brother. I want you to tear down the empire that trades human lives for territory and money. I want you to make sure no other family gets the phone call I got, telling them their brother bled out on a sidewalk while your people drove away. She leaned forward, her voice dropping but intensifying. If your transformation is real, if this awakening or whatever you want to call it is genuine, it has to have consequences beyond your personal comfort. Beyond feeling sorry. Beyond sitting in churches at night wrestling with your conscience. What are you asking me to do? Rossi asked, though part of him already knew. I'm asking you to choose, Isabella said. Between the empire you built and the man you claim you want to become. Between maintaining power and actually changing. Because you can't have both. She pulled her coat tighter against the wind. Redemption that costs you nothing isn't redemption, she said. It's just another form of taking. You want to take the comfort of feeling like a better person while keeping all the benefits of being a monster. That's not how it works. The words hit like physical blows, each one landing with the weight of truth he'd been avoiding. If I walk away from my organization, Rossi said slowly, if I dismantle what I've built, people will die. My lieutenant is already planning a coup. The power vacuum will trigger wars. Rivals will move in. The violence won't stop, it will escalate. That's not my problem to solve, Isabella said, her voice sharp. You created this situation. You built an empire on violence, and now you're afraid of the consequences of leaving it. But that fear doesn't make the empire less evil. It just makes you responsible for more than you want to acknowledge. She stood, and for a moment Rossi thought she was leaving. But she turned back to face him. You want to know what Daniel would say if he were here? Her voice broke slightly. He'd say that everyone deserves a chance to change. That transformation is possible for everyone. He believed in redemption and second chances and the fundamental goodness of people. Tears ran down her face now, but she didn't wipe them away. But he'd also say that change without sacrifice is just performance. That you can't ask for grace while clutching the weapons that hurt people. That real transformation means laying down the power that makes you feel safe and trusting something bigger than violence to sustain you. Rossi stood, feeling the weight of her words settling into his chest. I don't know if I can do that, he admitted. I've survived by being stronger, more ruthless, more willing to use violence than my enemies. I don't know how to be vulnerable and survive. Then maybe you don't, Isabella said quietly. Maybe the price of genuine change is that steep. Maybe transforming from monster to human means risking everything, including your life. She started to walk away, then paused. The guitar I gave you, Daniel played that for people who were dying. Cancer patients. People in hospice. He'd sit with them and play whatever they wanted to hear. He'd make their last hours less lonely. She looked back at Rossi. He died alone on a sidewalk while your people ran. He died because you valued power more than his life. So don't tell me change is hard or scary or risky. Don't tell me you don't know if you can give up your empire. Because Daniel gave up everything, and he didn't get a choice. She walked away then, leaving Rossi standing alone on the path while life continued around him in all its ordinary beauty. He looked down at the photograph still in his hand. Daniel laughing, full of life and purpose, believing in redemption and second chances. Isabella was right. He'd wanted redemption without cost. Transformation without sacrifice. The comfort of feeling like a better person while maintaining the empire that made him powerful. But that wasn't how it worked. Genuine change required dismantling everything he'd built. Walking away from the only life he knew. Risking vulnerability and probable death. Choosing to become human again even if it cost him everything. The door is always open, Father DeAngelis had said. You don't get to forget, Isabella had demanded. You remember any other melodies? Moses had asked. And now, redemption that costs you nothing isn't redemption. Rossi stood in the park watching Isabella disappear into the crowd, understanding finally what transformation would require. Not just acknowledgement of his sins. Not just sorrow or willingness to change. But sacrifice. The complete dismantling of Vincent, the ghost, Rossi and everything he built, with no guarantee he'd survive the fall. The question wasn't whether change was possible. The question was whether he loved his empire more than he hated what he'd become. And for the first time in 30 years, Vincent Rossi knew the answer. The text message came Sunday evening, from a number Rossi didn't recognize, basement jam session tonight. 11 p.m. The Underground, Delancey Street. Come as Vinny, not Vincent. Leave the ghost at home. MB. Rossi stared at his phone, understanding immediately what Moses was offering, a chance to step outside the fortress he'd built, to remember who he'd been before violence became his native language. He almost didn't go. The smart play was to focus on the Marco situation, to shore up his defenses, to prepare for the confrontation that was coming. But Isabella's words kept echoing, redemption that costs you nothing isn't redemption. At 10:45 p.m., Rossi told Tommy he was going out alone. The enforcer's face showed concern, the boss going anywhere unprotected was against protocol, but something in Rossi's expression made him step aside. The underground wasn't on any tourist map or restaurant guide. It was a basement club accessed through an unmarked door between a bodega and a laundromat, downstairs that had been worn smooth by generations of feet. The kind of place that had survived every wave of gentrification by being too authentic to replicate, too beloved to close. Rossi hadn't been here in 33 years. The last time, he'd been 19, nursing a single beer for 3 hours, listening to Moses Bennett play saxophone like he was channeling something divine. The door at the bottom of the stairs opened into a low-ceilinged room that smelled of beer and sweat and history. Maybe 40 people scattered at small tables, dim lighting, a tiny stage in the corner where a upright bass, piano, and drum kit waited. The walls were covered with photographs, jazz legends who'd played here over the decades, their faces watching over the current generation. No one looked at Rossi twice. Here, he wasn't Vincent, the ghost, Rossi, feared crime boss. He was just another middle-aged man in jeans and a sweater, looking for music in a basement. Moses was at a corner table, his saxophone case open beside him, talking with a younger musician. He saw Rossi enter and smiled, gesturing him over. "You came," Moses said, genuine warmth in his voice. "Wasn't sure you would." "Neither was I," Rossi admitted. "Grab a seat. We go on in 10 minutes. Just, listen. Like you used to." Rossi ordered a beer he wouldn't drink and settled at a table near the back, away from the stage but close enough to feel the music. Around him, conversations hummed, musicians talking about gigs and day jobs, couples on dates, jazz devotees who'd come for the art rather than the scene. Normal people living normal lives. The kind of life Vinnie Rossi might have had if he'd chosen differently at 19. The lights dimmed. Moses took the stage with 3 other musicians, a young woman on piano, a grizzled bassist who looked 70, a drummer with gray dreadlocks. No introduction, no announcement. They just began to play. The first song was a ballad, slow and aching, the kind of thing that created space for emotion rather than filling it with noise. Moses's saxophone sang with a depth that made Rossi's chest hurt, not the flashy virtuosity of youth, but the hard-won wisdom of someone who'd survived hell and learned to make beauty from the wreckage. This was what transformation sounded like. Between sets, Moses sat at Rossi's table, wiping down his saxophone with a soft cloth, the instrument gleaming under the dim lights. "You hear the difference?" Moses asked. "Between how I play now and how I played 30 years ago when you used to come here." "It's deeper," Rossi said. "More honest, maybe." Moses nodded. "Took me years to get here. When I was using, I played fast and loud, trying to cover up the screaming in my head. Technique without soul. After I got clean, I had to learn how to play all over again. Had to learn that the music isn't about showing off, it's about telling the truth." He set the saxophone carefully in its case. "I destroyed everything for the high," Moses said, his voice quiet but steady. "My marriage. My recording contract. My relationship with my daughter, she didn't speak to me for 12 years. I pawned instruments, stole from friends, lied to everyone who tried to help me. Thought I was too far gone. Thought the music had died in me permanently." A waitress brought Moses a glass of water, and he nodded thanks before continuing. "But someone gave me a chance I didn't deserve. Minister at a church I wandered into, looking for money to steal. He didn't call the cops. Didn't lecture me. Just said, 'You look like you used to be someone.' Then he offered me a bed, a meal, and the phone number for a rehab program." Moses took a sip of water. "I've been clean 31 years now. Spent that time making different music than the screaming in my head. Making amends where I could. Accepting that some things can't be fixed, only grieved. Learning that transformation doesn't erase the past, it just gives you a different relationship with it." He looked directly at Rossi. "You've been playing the same violent song for 3 decades, Vinnie. Same chords, same progression, just louder and faster. You remember any other melodies?" Rossi felt something cracking in his chest, the armor he'd maintained for so long developing fissures he couldn't repair. "I'm not sure I remember how," he admitted. "That's why you practice," Moses said. "One note at a time. One choice at a time. You don't have to be perfect, you just have to be willing." The other musicians were returning to the stage. Moses stood, picking up his saxophone. "This next set, really listen. Don't think about your empire or your problems or your decisions. Just, let the music in. Remember what it feels like to experience beauty without controlling it." The second set began with Coltrane's Naima, the love song that had made 19-year-old Vinnie cry. Moses played it with heartbreaking tenderness, each note a prayer, the melody unfolding like a flower opening to sunlight. Rossi listened. Really listened, for the first time in decades. He heard the conversation between instruments, the spaces between notes where meaning lived, the way beauty could be created from nothing but breath and skill and the willingness to be vulnerable. He heard what Moses had been trying to tell him, that transformation was possible, that the screaming could be replaced with song, that the man you became didn't have to be the man you were. The music washed over him, and Rossi felt tears running down his face. Not tears of fear or anger or the violent emotions that had sustained him for 30 years. Not tears of guilt or shame, though those were present too. Tears of grief. Grief for the beauty he'd abandoned when he chose violence. Grief for the boy who'd sat in this same room at 19, believing loyalty meant protection rather than domination. Grief for 30 years spent building an empire instead of a life, accumulating power instead of connection, becoming a ghost instead of a human. But beneath the grief, something else, possibility. The music proved that transformation was real. Moses had destroyed everything and rebuilt himself into something more honest, more beautiful, more human. Coltrane had survived addiction and found God and created a love supreme. People changed. Monsters became human again. It was possible. The cost was steep, everything you'd built, everything you thought you needed, the armor that kept you safe. But it was possible. When the set ended, Rossi couldn't speak. Couldn't move. Just sat with tears drying on his face, feeling something he hadn't felt since he was young, hope. Moses returned to the table, seeing Rossi's face, understanding without words what had happened. You felt it, the old musician said softly. The possibility. Rossi nodded, not trusting his voice. Here's the thing about transformation, Vinny, Moses said, leaning forward. It's not about becoming someone new. It's about excavating who you were before you buried yourself. That boy who cried during Neema. He's still in there. You just have to choose to let him breathe again. I don't know if I can survive that choice, Rossi said, his voice hoarse. Maybe not, Moses acknowledged. Maybe the cost is your life. But at least you die as yourself instead of the ghost you've been pretending to be. He stood, preparing for the final set. You've got decisions to make, I know. But remember this, beauty is still possible. Connection is still possible. Music is still possible. Even for someone who's played the violent song for as long as you have. The final set was pure improvisation, the musicians following each other into territory they'd never explored before, creating something that had never existed and would never exist again. Risk and trust and the willingness to be vulnerable, all expressed in sound. This is what it looks like to choose differently, Rossi thought. To step into the unknown and trust that beauty can emerge from chaos. When he left the underground at 1:30 a.m., climbing the worn stairs back to street level, Vincent Rossi was still crying. But for the first time in 30 years, he wasn't afraid. He was ready. Ready to dismantle the empire. Ready to face Marco. Ready to risk everything for the possibility of becoming human again. Ready to remember that he'd once been Vinny, and that boy, buried and suffocated and nearly destroyed, deserved a chance to breathe. The music had returned. And with it, the possibility of transformation. Even for monsters. Even for ghosts. Even for him. The call came at 6:47 a.m. on Monday, Tommy's voice tight with urgency. Boss, we need to meet. Now. Not the office, somewhere secure. They met in a warehouse Rossi owned in Red Hook, empty except for shipping containers and the echo of their footsteps on concrete. Tommy had brought 3 manila folders, each one thick with surveillance photos, transcripts, and financial records. It's worse than we thought, Tommy said, spreading the evidence across a makeshift table made from pallets. Marco's not just planning a coup. He's orchestrating your complete elimination. The first folder showed Marco meeting with Anthony Costello and 2 other family heads at a restaurant in Staten Island. The photos were time-stamped from 3 nights ago. While Rossi had been at the underground, remembering what music felt like, Marco had been negotiating his betrayal. He's offering them territory in exchange for support, Tommy explained. Brooklyn docks, the construction unions, half our legitimate businesses. He's basically selling off pieces of the empire to finance taking it over. The second folder contained transcripts of phone conversations, obtained through wiretaps Rossi's organization maintained on key personnel. Marco's voice, recorded and transcribed, discussing logistics, Rossi's been distracted lately. Soft. Meeting with priests, spending time in that old neighborhood. He's lost his edge. We move Friday night, make it look like a hit from the Gambinis. Clean succession. The third folder was the worst, financial records showing Marco had been skimming for months, building a war chest. And a meeting schedule with FBI Special Agent Sarah Chen, the same agent who'd been investigating Rossi's organization for 2 years. He's giving them everything, Tommy said, his voice hard with anger. Names, locations, financial flows. He's planning to flip, get immunity, and take over what's left after you're arrested or dead. He doesn't care which. Rossi stared at the evidence, his mind calculating angles with the cold precision that had kept him alive for 30 years. Marco had been thorough. The betrayal was comprehensive. If Rossi didn't act immediately, he'd lose everything, his organization, his freedom, quite possibly his life. We can move tonight, Tommy said, pulling out a tactical plan. Marco's meeting his girlfriend at a restaurant in Queens. We take him in the parking lot. Clean. Fast. Send his body to the Costellos with a message. Then we purge anyone who knew about this, his crew, anyone who met with him, anyone who showed even a hint of disloyalty. Tommy looked at Rossi with absolute certainty. A blood purge. Like the old days. Remind everyone why you're called the Ghost. Reassert dominance through terror. Make sure no one ever thinks about betraying you again. He pulled out a burner phone. I just need the word, boss. One call and we mobilize. Marco's dead by midnight, and this problem disappears. Rossi looked at the phone in Tommy's hand. The solution was elegant, proven, effective. The old Rossi, the Rossi from 2 weeks ago, would have already given the order. Would have felt the satisfaction of eliminating a threat, the electric surge of power reasserted. But he couldn't speak. Instead, he saw Daniel Hart's face. Heard Isabella's voice, *redemption that costs you nothing isn't redemption. It's just another form of taking, *. Heard Father DeAngelis in the quiet church, you can't erase what's done, only choose differently now. Heard Moses's saxophone playing transformation, proving that people could become something other than their worst selves. Boss? Tommy prompted, confusion creeping into his voice. What are you waiting for? How many people would die? Rossi asked quietly. Tommy blinked, not understanding the question. In the purge? Marco for sure. Probably 6, maybe 8 others who were involved or knew about it. Plus whoever gets in the way. Why? Because I'm trying to count the bodies, Rossi said, his voice hollow. Trying to add them to the list I've been keeping in my head. Daniel Hart. The 15 executions I've ordered. The people who died in territorial wars. The families destroyed. I'm trying to figure out where it stops. It stops when you're secure, Tommy said, his voice taking on an edge of urgency. When threats are eliminated and everyone remembers why you rule. Boss, this isn't the time for philosophy. Marco is coming for you. If you don't move first, you're dead. Rossi knew Tommy was right. The tactical analysis was sound. The threat was real and immediate. Marco had the Costellos, the FBI, and a detailed plan. Showing mercy now would be interpreted as weakness. The organization would fracture. Rivals would smell blood. The empire would collapse, and Rossi would likely die in the chaos. The violent solution would preserve everything he'd built. Would maintain his power, his security, his position as someone who couldn't be challenged. But it would also confirm everything he feared about himself. That he was beyond redemption. That violence was his only language. That the boy Moses remembered had indeed suffocated, leaving nothing but the ghost. Give me 24 hours, Rossi said. We don't have 24 hours, Tommy argued. Marco moves Friday. That's 4 days. We need to hit him now, while we have the advantage of knowing his plan. I understand the tactical situation, Rossi said, his voice harder now. I'm still telling you, 24 hours. I need to think. Tommy's face showed something Rossi had never seen before, doubt. Not in the decision, but in Rossi himself. Boss, are you Tommy hesitated. Are you compromised somehow? These meetings with the priest, the woman who confronted you, that old musician. They're getting in your head. Making you soft when you need to be hard. Maybe, Rossi admitted. Or maybe they're reminding me of something I forgot. What? Tommy demanded. That surviving isn't the same as living. That power isn't the same as purpose. That I built an empire to never be helpless, and instead built a prison I can't escape. Tommy stared at him like he was speaking a foreign language. Boss, I don't understand what's happening to you, but I know this, if you don't handle Marco, I will. Because I'm not watching you throw away everything we've built because you're having some kind of midlife crisis. The threat was implicit but clear. Tommy was loyal to the Empire, not to a version of Rossi who seemed to be abandoning it. Stand down, Rossi said, his voice carrying the command that had controlled men for 3 decades. That's an order. No one touches Marco until I say so. You're making a mistake, Tommy said. Probably, Rossi agreed. But it's mine to make. After Tommy left, radiating frustration and confusion, Rossi sat alone in the warehouse surrounded by evidence of betrayal. He pulled out his phone and looked at the contacts he'd accumulated over the past 2 weeks. Father DeAngelis. Isabella Hart. Moses Bennett. 3 voices that had cracked open the armor he'd maintained for 30 years. 3 strangers who'd asked questions he couldn't ignore. The door is always open. What do you want to leave behind? You remember any other melodies? He thought about the choice in front of him. The violent solution that would preserve his empire but destroy his soul. The alternative that would cost him everything, his organization, his security, quite possibly his life, but might salvage whatever humanity remained. Isabella had been right, redemption that cost nothing wasn't redemption. It was just another form of taking. If his transformation was real, it had to have consequences. Real consequences. Terrifying consequences. He could order Marco's execution and maintain power through fear, proving that 30 years of violence had indeed killed Vinny completely. Or he could choose differently. Could walk away from the empire. Could dismantle what he'd built. Could risk vulnerability and probable death for the possibility of becoming human again. The trigger or the altar. The throne or transformation. The ghost or Vinny. Rossi stood in the empty warehouse, holding evidence of betrayal in one hand and his phone with 3 saved contacts in the other, understanding finally that there was no middle path. He'd spent 30 years trying to have both, trying to be powerful and human, ruthless and good, Vincent and Vinny. But they were incompatible. The empire he'd built to protect himself had become the thing destroying him. He had to choose. And whatever he chose would define not just how he lived, but who he was in the moment of choosing. The sun rose higher, light streaming through the warehouse's dirty windows. Outside, the city woke to another Monday, ordinary people living ordinary lives, making small choices that shaped their days. Inside, Vincent Rossi stood at the crossroads that would determine everything. And for the first time in 30 years, he wasn't sure which path he'd take. But he knew he had to decide soon. Because Marco was coming. The empire was crumbling. And time was running out. The message to Marco was simple, Wednesday, 8 p.m. Warehouse 7, Red Hook. Just you and me. Time we talked. Rossi spent the 2 days before the meeting in a strange state of clarity. He visited his mother's grave for the first time in 5 years, standing in the cold October wind, telling her he was sorry for what he'd become and that he was trying to choose differently now. He donated Daniel's guitar to a children's hospital, anonymously, with instructions that it be used for music therapy. He listened to A Love Supreme on repeat, letting Coltrane's journey from brokenness to grace wash over him like a baptism. He didn't tell Tommy about the meeting. Didn't mobilize his enforcers. Didn't prepare for war. He just prepared to choose. Wednesday arrived cold and clear, the kind of evening where autumn felt like winter's warning. Rossi arrived at the warehouse at 7:30 p.m., half an hour early, wanting to be present in the space before Marco arrived. The building was one of his older properties, acquired 20 years ago when he was still consolidating power, used now for legitimate shipping operations that masked other activities. Empty pallets stacked against walls. The smell of diesel and salt water. Windows high above that let in the fading daylight but kept the interior shadowed. It felt appropriate somehow, a space between legitimate and criminal, light and dark, past and future. Rossi stood in the center of the warehouse floor, his Glock 19 tucked in his waistband, feeling its weight against his spine. Insurance, though he wasn't sure anymore what he was insuring against. Marco arrived precisely at 8 p.m., entering through the main door with the confidence of someone who'd already won. He was 43, sharp-featured, immaculately dressed even for what he thought was a business meeting. His own weapon was visible in a shoulder holster, no pretense between them anymore. "Vincent," Marco said, his voice carrying across the empty space. "You wanted to talk?" "Just us?" Rossi asked. "My guys are outside." "Yours too, I assume?" "No," Rossi said. "Just me." Marco's eyes narrowed, suspicious. "That's not like you. Not smart, coming alone." "A lot of things aren't like me anymore," Rossi said. They stood 15 feet apart, two men who'd survived wars together, now facing each other across an unbridgeable divide. Marco's hand rested near his weapon, not threatening but ready. "I know about the Costellos," Rossi said. "The FBI. The financial records. Your plan to move Friday night." Marco didn't deny it. "Then you know this conversation is pointless. You should have killed me 2 days ago when you had the chance. Now my people are mobilized. You pull that gun, you die 30 seconds later." "Probably," Rossi agreed. "But that's not why I asked you here." "Then why?" Rossi looked at the man who'd been his most trusted lieutenant for 8 years. They'd survived federal investigations together, territorial wars, internal purges. Marco had been reliable, ruthless, effective. Everything Rossi had valued. "I wanted to ask you a question," Rossi said. "When you look at what we've built, this empire, this organization, this life, what do you see?" Marco's expression showed confusion. "Power. Security. Respect. Everything you taught me to value." "That's what I thought too," Rossi said quietly. "For 30 years, I believed that. But I was wrong." "What are you talking about?" 2 years ago, we expanded into Costello territory. Mulberry and Hester. You remember? Of course. We sent a message, secured the territory. Good tactical move. A respiratory therapist named Daniel Hart was caught in the crossfire, Rossi continued. 28 years old. Engaged to be married. He helped sick kids breathe. He played guitar at nursing homes. He died on the sidewalk in 4 minutes while we drove away. Marco's face remained impassive. Collateral damage. Unfortunate, but unavoidable in our business. That's what I told myself, Rossi said. But I was lying. His sister found me. Showed me photos. Made me see his face, know his name, understand what we destroyed. And I realized something, I've built an empire on corpses. 30 years of violence, and for what? So I could sit alone in a penthouse, master of nothing that matters, terrified of the silence inside myself. You're losing your mind, Marco said, genuinely concerned now. Whatever's happening to you, this priest you've been meeting, these people getting in your head, it's making you weak. Dangerous. You're right, Rossi said. I am dangerous. But not the way you think. He reached slowly behind his back, and Marco's hand moved to his weapon. But Rossi just pulled out the Glock, held it for a moment feeling its familiar weight, and then set it carefully on the concrete floor. What are you doing? Marco demanded. Making a choice, Rossi said. One true thing at a time. He stepped away from the weapon, hands visible and empty. You want the empire? Rossi said, his voice steady despite the fear coursing through him. Take it. I'm done building on corpses. I'm done justifying violence as business. I'm done being the ghost. Marco stared at him like he'd spoken in tongues. This is a trick. Some kind of setup. No trick, Rossi said. I'm walking away. The organization, the territory, the operations, it's yours. I won't fight you. Won't interfere. I'm just done. You can't be serious, Marco said, his weapon now fully drawn but pointed at the ground, confusion overriding training. You'd never abandon what you built. You'd die first. Maybe I am dying, Rossi said. The me I've been for 30 years. Vincent, the ghost Rossi, who valued power over people, survival over living, empire over humanity. That man is dying. And I'm choosing to let him. Father DeAngelis's words echoed, one true thing at a time. Isabella's challenge resonated, redemption that costs you nothing isn't redemption. Moses's question haunted, you remember any other melodies? This is insane, Marco said, but his weapon slowly lowered. What about the Costellos? The FBI? The people who'll come for you the second you're not protected? That's my problem now, Rossi said. Not yours. You'll lose everything. The money, the properties, your identity. You'll be nobody. Better to be nobody than to be this, Rossi said, gesturing at the warehouse, the empire it represented, the life of violence it symbolized. Marco studied him for a long moment, searching for deception, finding only exhaustion and something that might have been hope. If you're serious, Marco said slowly, if this isn't some elaborate trap, then tomorrow morning I meet with the captains. Tell them you're stepping down. Voluntary retirement. I take over operations, restructure the organization my way. Do what you want, Rossi said. Just, try to minimize the collateral damage. Remember that every person caught in crossfire has a face. A name. People who love them. You really have lost your mind, Marco said, but there was something like pity in his voice now. Rossi walked toward the door, leaving his weapon on the concrete, leaving his empire in the hands of a man who'd planned to kill him, leaving everything he'd built for 30 years. Vincent, Marco called after him. Why? Really? Why would you throw it all away? Rossi paused at the threshold, looking back at the warehouse, at Marco standing confused and armed in its center, at the Glock lying abandoned on the floor. Because I remembered something I'd forgotten, he said. That surviving isn't the same as living. That power isn't the same as being human. That the boy I buried 30 years ago deserved a chance to breathe. He walked out into the October night, leaving Vincent, the ghost, Rossi behind in the darkness. Outside, the city hummed with life, cars passing, voices in the distance, music from a nearby restaurant. Normal sounds of normal people living normal lives. The kind of life Vinny had once imagined before violence became his answer to everything. His phone buzzed. Messages from Tommy, from other captains, sensing something was wrong. He turned it off. That world was done now. He'd sacrificed everything, his organization, his wealth, his identity, his security. The FBI would likely still come. The Costellos might decide an unprotected Rossi was an opportunity. Tommy might view his abdication as betrayal worth punishing. He might not survive the month. But for the first time in 30 years, Vincent Rossi felt alive. Not safe. Not powerful. Not secure. But alive. Human. Real. He thought about calling Father DeAngelis, but it felt too soon. This wasn't about celebration or absolution. This was just the beginning of the long, uncertain work of transformation. Instead, he walked. No destination. No security. No empire. Just a man who'd remembered his name was Vinny, and that maybe, just maybe, the boy who'd loved Coltrane and believed in beauty wasn't completely dead. The door had been open all along. He'd finally walked through it. And whatever waited on the other side, legal consequences, danger, poverty, death, or the possibility of becoming human again, he would face it as himself. Not the ghost. Not the monster. Just Vinny, choosing differently, one true thing at a time. Enjoyed this story? Subscribe. We've got dozens more.